You're having dinner and enjoying camaraderie with the people around you, balanced with this journey and narrative. There is sort of a sense of procession through time and history at the same time you're going through the different courses of this meal. And so in that way, and then obviously with the music too, there is this holistic aspect to this narrative. You are hearing, you are tasting, and you are learning about this important local feast and its origins. Yeah.
Welcome to the Singing Dancing Catholic, where we talk about music, theater, dance, media, and performing arts from the Catholic perspective. I'm James Mark. The Singing Dancing Catholic is the official podcast of Oratorio, St. Louis's only urban center for Catholic cultural and performing arts, located at St. Francis de Sales Oratory in Fox Park, St. Louis. The mission of Oratorio is to enrich with performing arts the shared effort to keep Fox Park a beautiful place to live. For information on cultural events, concerts, dances, music lessons, and how you can participate, visit oratoriostl.com. And now about today's guest. Hailing from New York, Scott Varian turns to the social scene in St. Louis for sustenance. He has become over time an impresario behind many meaningful social gatherings, fostering community through adventuresome cooking, culturally distinct music, domestic and civic ceremony, and inspiring discussions on history, literature, and poetry, all from his Victorian brick home, which he rehabbed himself, in South City, St. Louis. He's here today to tell us about Three Flags Day, a holiday commemorating a peculiar turn of events which occurred in the March of 1804, when the region of St. Louis was informed, albeit several months late, that it had been transferred from Spanish to French to American sovereignty. While Three Flags Day began as a merely legal transaction, Scott has found a way to revive the holiday through a combination of ceremonious ritual with a multi-course meal, serving up the flavors of Spain, France, and America, all amidst the ambiance of candlelight. For the guests, the experience of Three Flags Day is a journey through time and place, where the flavors of each course are accompanied by the music particular to each of the three nations, from Spanish flair to French sophistication to American frontierism. Being totally unique to St. Louis, Three Flags Day is a 100% local holiday. As a strong patron of community, Scott will share with us today how Three Flags Day provides St. Louisians of all walks of life with localization and cultural identity, a celebration of their own.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
What is Three Flags Day?
So Three Flags Day is a local celebration that was celebrated here in St. Louis, and I'll get into the history in 1 second, but it waned in popularity. I'll start with this. It waned in popularity in the early to mid 20th century. So for people living in St. Louis now, probably not something that they have a living memory of, and maybe for some of the older people, maybe they heard about it at some point, but in the popular imagination, it has basically died off. But it actually is a celebration or commemoration of a day actually it was more like a series of 2 days in the year of 1804. So that was March 9th into March 10th, wherein there were three different flags that flew over the city of St. Louis. So it started with the Spanish flag, and then it transitioned to the French flag, and then finally into the American flag. So just to give you a little bit about the history of this, if that's okay. And I just want to put a disclaimer that I am no historian. I'm sure there are people in this city who know a lot more about
was that the year of or the year after the Louisiana Purchase?
So the Louisiana Purchase happened in 1803. I believe that's when it was actually transacted, but the ceremonies didn't occur until 1804 in March.
So they're related.
Yeah, they
It's
are. Yeah,
related.
I mean,
Okay.
St. Louis became American as part of the Louisiana Purchase. One of the issues, though, is that the actual transacting of the territory and the ceremonies that celebrated or officialized that transacting occurred in different years. And so the transacting occurred actually at the end of 1803, and that happened in France. And then by the time the word got to St. Louis, it was in 1804. And one of the reasons why there was three flags is because we were a Spanish territory for about 34 years in the latter half of the 18th century. That was after the 7 Years' War. The French had given all of their territories to the west of the Mississippi to to Spain, my apologies. And they had given all their territories to the east of the Mississippi River to Great Britain. They had lost those territories. And one of the reasons why they gave those territories to the west of the Mississippi, which includes St. Louis, to the Spanish, is out of fear that Great Britain would incur further into their territories. And so they gave it to Spain, which they believed to be relatively friendly hands, which had more of a foothold in North America and so can sufficiently defend and hold on to those lands. Under Napoleon, there was a game changer, and Napoleon had basically given up on his plans for a North American empire and instead was wholly invested in his wars in Europe. And so he saw there being a potential to raise some money for his wars with the new American Republic and in the sale of Louisiana, this territory that contained St. Louis, to the Americans. And so he was also afraid that he couldn't actually hold the Louisiana territory from the Americans and from the British. And so he concocted the plan, which was formalized in Paris in 1803 to sell this territory of Louisiana to the United States for a bargain. I think it was around $30 million. And so New Orleans was the main city in the Louisiana territory. St. Louis was a bit of an outpost to the north. It wasn't a very big city, but it had been established probably about a little over 30 years earlier.
Really? So it was smaller than New Orleans?
Yeah, New Orleans was the main port city, and St. Louis was, I mean, again, I'm not a historian, but it was probably more involved in fur trading and whatnot. It was not a port city. And, in the year that the Louisiana territory was transacted, so this is in the winter of 1803 into the early part of 1804, New Orleans had its ceremonies celebrating the transaction of the territory from Spain to France.
It had its first.
Yeah, it had its ceremonies before, and naturally so, because you would go to New Orleans and then you'd go sail up the river, and St. Louis naturally would hear of what was going on later, and maybe it's upstream as far as the river is concerned.
Does the
but
ceremony
it's
in any way exist in New Orleans to greater retention than it does in St. Louis? Do you know?
I don't think so. Well, for one, there was no Three Flags Day in New Orleans.
It happened in St. Louis.
It happened in St. Louis.
See. Okay.
And one of the reasons is because New Orleans got word of their being transacted from the Spanish to the French, whereas St. Louis never got word that it was transacted from the Spanish to the French until it was transacted to the Americans from the French, because this all happened over the course of a couple months in the winter. And so the key here is that the river was frozen over, and there was no other means really of transmitting the message to St. Louis that you are now French. So the transaction from Spanish to French happened. New Orleans was aware. They had their ceremonies, but St. Louis was unaware. So for all they knew, they were still Spanish when they were in fact French. I'm sorry if this is a bit confusing, but
no, I found it. So you're saying that the flags, like New Orleans did do it, but it wasn't all in one ceremony. It was spaced out because they got the news and they did it. Yeah. But St. Louis had to catch up.
St. Louis had to catch up after the winter in March. So this would be in March. The worst of the winter was over, and the Mississippi thawed, and so there was a contingent that came up from New Orleans to St. Louis to inform them that they were no longer Spanish, but they were French, and that they were they had been transacted to America. And so there were ceremonies that were arranged for on the day of March 9th into March 10th, wherein to commemorate the fact that they had been transacted back to France, and I'm saying back to because they were French 35 years earlier, they would have the flag of Spain taken down and the French flag flown for 6 hours, at which point they would then put the American flag up.
And why the 6 hours? Was that just perfunctory token honor to it? Or?
Yeah, I don't know where that would come from, but that was just sort of prescribed for the ceremony. And actually the 6 hours was changed to 24 hours And that was in large part an olive branch of the Americans, who then were in possession of St. Louis, to the French, because the people living in St. Louis at the time were largely French, ethnically speaking, not, born in St. Louis or during the French Empire here, or coming over from France to live in St. Louis, then certainly the sons and daughters of French men and French women. And so there was this memory of the French heritage of St. Louis. And so the Americans had granted permission that the French flag fly for a full 24 hours. And so when we say 3 Flags Day, it's a little bit incorrect. It's actually 3 Flags, 2 days, but 1 day, in the sense that, you have the Spanish flag at noon one day, French flag for 24 hours, and then noon the next day you have the American flag flying over St. Louis.
So Louisiana Purchase, which everybody knows about, that's sort of ubiquitous to the whole territory.
Sure.
But you're saying 3 Flags Day is unique to St. Louis.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, so, everybody in America and, whatever grade, 7th grade or whatnot, knows about the Louisiana Purchase, because it is obviously such a major component to the geographical reality of the United States and its expansion. But 3 Flags Day is just a little peculiarity or curiosity of St. Louis and its particular situation, with the transacting of these territories in the winter that didn't, allow or permit that they get word of that transaction.
Now, if I today had somebody come up from a different city and say, hey, by the way, a year ago, all this happened, we never told you, you never found out, but now that's the way it is, I would feel like there'd be some shock, maybe even some anger. Was there any turmoil that you know of? Did St. Louis argue with it? Was there a riot? Was there...
Like I said, I know the broad history of 3 Flags, what really happened, and the feelings of the people and any sort of resistance to that transaction. I can't necessarily speak to. My understanding and my guess, my supposition is that they were really not in a position to resist.
Is it possible even maybe they were happy to become American?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there was certainly celebrations that went on in the changing of the flags, and so it was wrapped in celebration. Whether or not there were certain sentiments underneath it, I can't say, but I'm sure there are historians that have delved into that question.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, the information you've got is quite exhaustive. This is fascinating. So how did you personally come to discover it, and how did you get interested in developing it into an event?
Sure. As you mentioned earlier in the bio, I am not from St. Louis originally. I'm from New York. But I've always had a curiosity into history, and especially into local history. And I always knew that St. Louis, because of its namesake, was French. But having been here and then going to St. Charles, I began to learn that there was this Spanish period, which is not as well known, actually, especially in popular history of America. And so I started looking into it. And I, in the meanwhile, became very enamored of St. Louis City from a perspective of architecture. I loved the local architecture and history. So I started delving into the history, and I wanted to know, particularly what its role was in the American Revolution. Was there anything going on here? And I stumbled across the 3 Flags Day, which really seemed to tie it all together, because it's sort of a little snapshot, this one little feast day ceremony commemoration that kind of describes and distills, that period of 50 years of history when this territory was, in between Spain, France, and the United States, and it kind of streamlined it. So I thought it was a sort of amazing local holiday, and I lamented the fact that it was lost. I think one of the things nowadays is, and especially amongst my generation, is we crave identity, especially local identity, and we sort of live a little bit in the graveyard of localism and local identity. And so there is a curiosity about history, but local history especially. And I think that, this 3 Flags Day fills that vacuum perfectly. I mean, we have the city of St. Louis. There's a great spirit with respect to sports and a lot of other things. There is a sense of, local cohesion, but this gives it, a historic character that ties many things together. And as I said, sort of fills that vacuum of this craving local identity and tradition and history. So that's a little bit of the background of why I'm interested in it. There's another little interesting point too, which is that in my capacity as architect, one of the offshoots of that. And I would do in architecture, interior design as well. There was always that component of it. When I moved to St. Louis, would go to some of the local restaurants and taste the food, especially against the backdrop of my East Coast origins, and so I was weighing the cuisine, the local gastronomy, but I also like the restaurant design. So that might not be something you're thinking I'm going to mention, but just the concept of the different concepts that these different restaurants in St. Louis have, and so I sometimes in my creativity think about different restaurant concepts that I've either experienced or think about and whether they would work or not. And so I always thought it would be a really great idea in the city of St. Louis to have a restaurant called the Three Flags. And
Let's do it.
Yeah, well, I mean, and actually, I need to say at this point, when I did my quick Google search and whatnot, it actually has been a concept which in one form or another has been explored in South City. And in South City, and I can't say exactly where in South City, but probably not very far from here. They actually had, it was maybe a tavern or a cafe. I don't know if it was a full-fledged, restaurant, but there has been in the last 20 years a Three Flags cafe, or as I said, tavern. So the idea has been explored, but in the little that I saw of that, it didn't necessarily manifest what my vision would be of having like separate parts of the restaurant or 3 different rooms being the different ambiance from Spain, France, and America.
Well, keep that thought, because some of our listeners right now are investors in urban development, so this could be their big. What would a Three Flags restaurant consist of? What would be the concept?
Well, I mean, it's sort of prepackaged. You have 3 different cultures, 3 different cuisines, 3 different aesthetics. And so from the design of the restaurant to the cuisine on the menu, you would have a Spanish component, a French component, an American component. So there would be a natural fusion element to this. You just fill in the details from there. I mean, from an architectural standpoint or interior design, and then from a culinary standpoint, I think it's something, they're diverse cuisines, and so there'd be something for every palate that, within those 3 cuisines. And
how does the role of that food, that kind of contrast between the palates, how does that play into your vision for the concept? As an event, if not a fixture of a restaurant.
Well, I'll give you a little bit of the history of the event, which is I was playing around with these ideas, and a good friend of mine from the local community and the sales community particularly, her name is Laura Jablonski. She came up to me, and I would have lots of events at my house, which I rehabbed, as you mentioned earlier. I rehabbed this modest Victorian home in South City, but I would have these social events. And we would do events like Burns Night. That was another one in January, and a couple of other events, and of course the major feasts of the year.
What's Burns Night?
Well, Burns Night is just a celebration of the Scottish poet Robert Burns, wherein they have Scottish cuisine. So haggis is obviously the big thing that's on. And I didn't really know very much about this, but we had a Scottish friend, as well as another friend who was very interested in literature and poetry. And so he had proposed to me, why don't we do a Burns Night? And so we celebrated Burns Night, and everybody loved it. I didn't really like the haggis, but that's just me. But a lot of people did.
They did.
Scotch eggs. And so, to be honest, now that I'm talking about it in this very moment, I do think there's a certain aspect of the Burns Night which then fed into Three Flags, because there was a bit of an envy for this Scottish, cultural and culinary feast which happened in January. So we had this at my house, and so my friend who I just mentioned earlier.
This is the house you rehabbed?
Yes, exactly. Laura, she said to me, I have this concept for one of your events from local history. And she didn't even mention the event. I just sort of took a shot in the dark there. I said, Are you referring to Three Flags Day? And her face lit up, and she said, yes, Three Flags Day. And then we went at it together, and I was like, I've been thinking about this restaurant called Three Flags and how I would design it. And even when I drive around South City, I pick abandoned buildings that I think would be really great locations and aesthetics to put this restaurant in. And it was from there that we sort of concocted this Three Flags, revived feast. I don't know if it has very much to do with the way it was celebrated for the 19th and early 20th century. So it's a little bit of an eclectic vision that we cobbled together based on this concept of Spain, France, and America.
So it sounds like your house, which you put so much work into the architecture of, seems to have become sort of a hub of these kinds of experimental cultural gatherings.
Sure.
And would you say that kind of goes into the science of it? I mean, this isn't just like a presentation for a passive audience. You've got a following of sorts. Tell us about the social component of putting something like this together.
I crave community. I mean, I'm not from here, so I don't have family here. So I find that I lean very heavily on the social scene and my friends to provide camaraderie, fraternity, and the emotional, sort of, sustenance from that. So I, naturally, I love hosting things. I'm the type of person that just likes it when people are enjoying themselves, in part due to my labors and the vision that I have. And so I would just host lots of things. And so there's a ready-made social group that I had, group texts and whatnot, where I just had to plug into that. And then I would have, 15 people over my house, right? So this friend group, I don't mean to be prideful here, but I think they enjoyed the events I would have at my house. And so if they got an invite for an event, especially if it was a little bit more formal, they would come. So I had sort of a ready-made group. And so when I floated this Three Flags idea, they took to it. They didn't know, well, most of them didn't know. A couple of the locals had heard about it, what Three Flags Day was. So they were coming at it with fresh eyes. And so we got a dining room full of about 22 to 24 people, which was a very crammed space. My dining room's not that large. It's kind of, as I said, a modest home, but made for a very cozy atmosphere. And so, yeah, it was in many ways the pilot for bringing this Three Flags Day out into the rest of the community. And I don't just mean DeSales, but St. Louis. I'd love to see this resurrected more generally.
I was going to say, if I got a nickel for every time I heard someone say they starved community, as you just did, I'd be retired, to a penthouse in Miami by now. I know you mentioned group chats and friend chats that you said existed.
Sure.
But it also sounds like you've trailblazed and discovered some people who may not have converged otherwise. Compared to Louisiana Purchase, it's far less familiar to people.
Sure.
But it's already got kind of a following.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I feel bad I couldn't invite more people, but there were, and I know we might be getting to this soon. It's certainly something I want to discuss, but there was this vision of not just having the cuisine change from Spanish to French to American over the course of this event, but also having a musical component too. Music has always, and I have to say, I have no musical talents, but I love to sing, and I love when my friends bring their instruments over. I have a piano that's there just for my friends who know how to play the piano, and we certainly do the singing, the carols at Christmas time and whatnot. So I had known when I decided to do this Three Flags Day that there would be a musical component to it too. However, like I said, I don't have musical talents, and so I knew I was going to have to lean on some of my friends, but also, perhaps import some as well. And so, as you were mentioning before, there was a convergence of different backgrounds, and some people who would not necessarily be a part of the social scene I had invited in to help with the food and to help with the music as well. And so you sort of see that there were these seeds of outgrowth in the first event that we had for Three Flags Day, for this becoming a culinary thing, but also a musical tradition as well.
And the music is somewhat analogous to the food in that it contrasts.
Yes.
Each nation gets its own representation musically.
Yeah. So I actually spent a fair amount of time creating or running with the concept of Three Flags Day, making it into like a full experience in a narrative way. You're taking a journey through Spain to France to America throughout the course of the meal. And so I thought about this, I developed it, and I thought, well, why not have like a Spanish course that takes place theoretically in Spain? We can have a Spanish guitar, and we'll have a little bit of history to it too. So somebody will get up and read about the background of the Louisiana Purchase, the sort of the lead up to Three Flags Day. And so there is a component that takes place in Spain with the Third Treaty of San Ildefonso, where the Louisiana territory was transacted from Spain to the French. So the French minister was there. So, this first course theoretically takes place there in Madrid, Spain. You hear a little bit about that. And then you go on to your second course, and that takes place in Paris, France. And that's where you hear a little bit of the background of the Louisiana territory being transacted between, Napoleon's regime and the dignitaries of Thomas Jefferson in Paris. Mm-hmm. So that would be your second course. And you would have French music, and you'd have a little bit of that history. And then you would move into the third course, and the third course would take place in Washington, D.C., which was, the new capital at the time in 1803. Mm-hmm. And it would tell you about what was going on in Washington, D.C. with Thomas Jefferson and what he was thinking about acquiring Louisiana, what his goals were. And you would be served American food. Now, we tried to make it a little bit period. I know everybody says, what's American food? But it's like we did a chicken pot pie because that was, sort of rustic and traditional. Mm-hmm. It goes back to England, and it goes back far before the colonial period even. And then we would move further in the course, and we would move to St. Louis, and that's when we would actually go through a rundown of how Three Flags Day went down. So we went through these first three courses. Everybody would have the food from those countries, they'd have the music from that country, they'd have the historical background about what happened in that country that led up to this day, and then we would go to St. Louis and we would go through the events of that day, and so we would describe a little bit of the ceremonies of that day. Now, we did that during the cheese course, which we had after these three courses. They were small courses for those listening, if you're wondering how everybody ate this much food, but they were small courses, and so it told you about what the people of St. Louis were doing that day, how they were singing French songs in the local church to celebrate the French flag, which they had fondly remembered. It also has the speeches that were given by the Spanish lieutenant governor at the time, de la Suze, when he was, addressing the crowds as, it was being transacted away from Spain. It had the speech of Amos Stoddard, who was the American representative and governor that was taking possession in the name of the Americans. So you get a little bit of the speeches that went on at Three Flags Day while you're eating your cheeses. And then I had this little bit of an afterthought too, which is, why don't we do a little bit of a fast forward to the Louisiana Purchase Exposition of 1903, 1904. 1904, I'm sorry, even though it happened in 1803, the celebration was in 1904 for 100 years. And so that would go over a little bit of the history of St. Louis and its first 100 years since the Louisiana Purchase. And so we played some ragtime, some Scott Joplin, and so that sort of contextualized it with respect to an event that most people in St. Louis do know, and they have heard about, like everybody in the city has heard about, the St. Louis Exposition, World's Fair Exposition.
Sure. And you said it is around that time that it actually, Three Flags Day fell out of memory more or less.
Yeah, and again, this is sort of like, I haven't dug very deeply into the fading away of this local feast, but from what I have read, it was, around this time, perhaps a little bit afterwards, that the local feast kind of faded away into memory.
What are some other cultural events like this that draw community around like a cultural identity piece that you know of? Any?
Well,
not just Three Flags Day.
Yeah, sure. In America, I'm thinking about it, and I'm sure there's something I'm missing, but I can't really think of anything off the top of my head. Mm-hmm. Certainly when I was in New York, I can't think of anything similar to Three Flags Day. I do know that like in Europe, they'll have local feasts that have been going on, and they'll have parades like in Gubbio, Italy, and then there's some towns in northern France, and they'll have their different characters that are associated with that town. I think that is something of like a comparable commemoration or feast, but I can't think of much in this country that has such a local character and tradition. So
the closest I can think of is Mardi Gras, but Mardi Gras has sort of been copied by other localities.
Yeah, I mean, a Mardi Gras, you can hardly say that it's a local feast day. It's Fat Tuesday. It's part of the liturgical calendar. I do grant that, obviously there is that association with New Orleans. Mm-hmm. So and so in a way, yes, in a way there is a local character. People say New Orleans Mardi Gras, but there's nothing about Mardi Gras itself, which is endemic or essential to New Orleans specifically, as Three Flags is to St. Louis.
Sure.
Yeah.
So if you continue this, if Three Flags is revived and we see this become an annual tradition, what would people who attend it look forward to experiencing? You've described the food, you've described the music. If I was a guest there, what would my evening look like?
Sure. I mean, I just would want it to be, and the way I've crafted it is for it to be an immersive experience where you're having dinner and enjoying camaraderie with the people around you, balanced with this journey and narrative. There is sort of a sense of procession through time and history at the same time you're going through the different courses of this meal. And so in that way, and then obviously with the music too, there is this holistic aspect to this narrative. You are hearing, you are tasting, and you are learning about this important local feast and its origins. Yeah.
Fantastic. Scott, thank you so much for putting the event together, for developing, and for talking with us about it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me.
The mission of Oratorio is to enrich with music the shared effort to keep Fox Park a beautiful place to live. For information on cultural events, concerts, dances, music lessons, and how you can participate, visit oratoriostl.com. Thank you for listening.